Alrighty, for today's recap video, we are talking about a slightly new focus for this opening part of the week. We're doing a project called Poetry in Motion, and we're going to be talking about a challenge that you're going to face, what your assignment is, what things you're going to turn in, and then a little bit of the technique work. All right, so if we get started, we're first going to be talking about the challenge. So this is based off of a project that the New York Times completes, I want to say yearly. The challenge is to interpret poetry in images. So you are creating the images yourself. We want you to be inspired by the language found in the poems. Maybe you're zooming in on a specific word or a phrase or a couple of lines of the poems. Maybe it's the rhythm of the poem itself that inspires you. So you want to think what's from the poem sticks out to you and how are you interpreting that inspiration into your image. You could ask yourself, how can you compose a picture to represent your inspiration? So you can choose to do a posed type of image where you're going to specifically stage maybe people or objects to create the picture yourself. Or you could do more of a candid style of photography where you kind of have this unposed mentality. You find something in real life, and the resulting picture kind of looks like it's been captured by accident, right? Both are entirely acceptable for this project. What you're actually going to turn in are three different things. You're going to pick one of the poems on the following list. It's 2 slides down from here, on slide 62 if you have this presentation open and you're following along with this video. You're going to pick one of the 8 poems, copy and paste it onto your graphic organizer. Then you're going to include your picture. Now, you can pick to do one picture or a gallery of pictures, but you need at least one to complete this assignment. And then the last thing that you're going to turn in is a short explanation of what inspired you from the poem and how that translates into the photography. So you can go a little bit more in depth and talk about the method of this was my inspiration, this is how my photograph captures that inspiration, and this was the method or kind of the how-to I took this picture. Specifically, if you're staging your own shot, that would be really helpful. Or if you're doing more of a candid style, you could stop and ask yourself, what made me stop? How am I going to translate that to my audience? Lastly, I just tried to brainstorm fairly quickly what a likely process would be for this assignment. Obviously, you have to read your poem. You're going to have to read your poem multiple times to really get a grasp on what you think the poem means to you. If your friend is doing the same poem and you're talking about meaning, that's great. It could be different from what someone else interprets the poem as. Poetry is highly subjective anyway. What one person takes from that poem is likely going to be very different from someone else. So really think, what does your poem mean? Followed pretty closely by allowing yourself to be flexible in that meaning. What you think one day your poem means might change once you see something in the real world when you're going to take this picture. You might have an idea already, and then something catches your interest in the real world and you never really thought of that meaning of a poem, and so you just kind of allow it to shift a little bit. That's a lot like what we've talked about in your writing cycles over the course of this year, where your first draft isn't always your best draft or your final looking draft. There has to be some revision that goes into your ideas. Same thing with this super short project. You also will probably want to take multiple shots for your picture. Each poem on the New York Times website is represented by a small gallery. I think the smallest is 4 pictures. I think the largest was 6. It might have been a little bit more than 6. There were a few that I kind of lost count on because they cycled through. But there was roughly that many pictures in most of the galleries. You could just turn in one image if you wanted to. You don't have to turn in an image gallery. Regardless of your choice, usually when we look at artwork or drafts, there are tons of other copies that the audience never gets to see. Or when you conducted interviews last week. You were supposed to create a list of questions that you might not even ask all of those questions when you're interviewing your subject, but it's better to have them prepared and not have to scramble at the last minute to find information. Instead, it's better to be over-prepared and not necessarily have to use all of them. Okay, so same thing here with pictures. And then the last step, which if you were present for the Zoom meeting, Mr. Dickinson kind of covered that part. We want you to take time to edit, and it kind of seems like an easy step or a kind of final look step, but we do want you to take a little bit of time to really think, is your image capturing the same feeling that you want it to, or is there something that you want to specifically hone in on? So you want to sharpen something in your image and blur out other things, or maybe you want to try and highlight a color or add some lighting to create that mood that you're trying to evoke. Okay, there are tons of free editing apps available in the App Store or Google Play. Just like doing a quick Google will likely bring up some options for you if that's something that you are unfamiliar with. But we do want you to take time to edit your image really as much as you see fit. Some of the examples are highly digitized where there's tons of editing. Some are really just kind of quick edits that make the image itself just kind of look a little bit more put together. All right. So that's kind of the process in compact form. You might need to add some steps. You might need to do things kind of in multiple steps. That's really up to you as the kind of artist or author or creator in this moment. But that's kind of the gist of what you're creating. So one more time, you're reading a poem multiple times to capture the meaning. You're taking a picture based off of your inspiration from the poem. How are you visually representing that poem? And then you're explaining your process in 3 steps. Right, the poems that you're going to choose from are from this list. Poems 1 through 7 are all available on poetryfoundation.org or .com. You just can click on one of these links. It'll take you directly there. Most, if not all of these poems, 1 through 7, have a audio version connected to them. If you want to listen to how a poet has interpreted this work, that is also an option. It's never a bad thing to hear it in multiple ways or to read it in multiple ways. Poem number 8 is not available online that I can find. It's a poem that I kind of fell in love with during a course that I was taking about contemporary poetry, and it's in an anthology that I have. So I just took a picture from it and uploaded it. It's That Morning Walk by Mary Oliver. It's a really, really short poem. What you see is the entire poem. But I think it's a really nice poem, and I'm interested to see how others may choose to interpret that as well. All right, so that one doesn't have an audio link to it. It doesn't have an additional website. It's just on the slide for you. Ms. Decker in the Zoom on Monday put together a quick example for us, and there's kind of lots happening on this slide. Don't overlook the links, guys. These 2 links, I'll go ahead and open them up, is from the inspiration for this project. So this top link is where we get a little bit of that explanation piece from the photographers themselves. So in the New York Times project, each photographer was assigned one poem and took different shots for their inspiration for that poem. And this is a list of their, I wish there was a way that we didn't have to see ads, but I don't think there is. They just have a really quick kind of explanation of their process, of their thinking when they were putting together compositions, and then an example of their work. These pictures on this page aren't the entire gallery. That's in a separate link. Okay, so this just zooms in on what is their kind of method in creating those photos. The second link, which is actually linked in both of these hyperlinks, but it's the second link on the slides, is the gallery with the poems themselves. All right, so a perfect example of what we're asking you to do as a project. All right, so this would be part 1, the poem. Now, these aren't your poems. These are the poems from the New York Times project. Part 2 would be the picture. All right, so every poet on here has a gallery going. And then part 3 is what's in this first link, their explanation, right? So Sig Harvey had the poem Edge by Layli Long Soldier. And then her explanation of why she put together the pictures that she did. That's this very first poem, Edge. We see the poet, the text of the poem itself, and then the photographers, so Sig Harvey's gallery over on, in this case, the left-hand side. They do kind of switch sides as you go. So all 6 of the original poems and the galleries are on this website. Explanations, I think going in the same order, are on this website. Your poems that you're picking from this project are on slide 62 of your slideshow. All right, and then the one included on slide 63 is an example of Ms. Decker's work. So this, I am offering this poem on the left-hand side of the screen, is one of the poems that you can choose from for this project. Then her picture that she took is in the middle, and then her explanation is on that far right side. She wrote 3 short paragraphs that's really kind of exactly like what you need to do, talking about her process and why she took the photo that she took, some of the editing that she chose to do. It's a little bit hard to tell in this kind of zoomed out perspective of the screen, but in the center image, I can't tell if you guys can tell, but there's a little bit of a vignette on this image, or there's been a little bit of editing here where we have this kind of blurred out and then fading into white editing happening around the edges. So we have kind of this oval shape pairing into this photo. So it's drawing our focus into the center. And then what she's done as a photographer is really set up the lines of her poem to a focal point. I want to say in art, this is called, oh gosh, the term just flew out of my head. It's something about perspective, force perspective maybe, where all of the lines leading to that horizon line, or that kind of center line where the earth meets the sky, all narrow down into that same point. So we see this line here kind of narrows this way, this line here narrows this way. So the street looks really, really long, and then it just kind of blends into that far horizon line. That is a pretty common style in lots of landscape photography, where our eye is drawn to one particular focus, and then we have all this negative space kind of around it that is not there to distract us. It's there to help like zoom in our focus onto that one point. All right, Mr. Dickinson had the last section of the lesson on Monday, which is mostly slide 64. And he got most of his information from this link. I'm not going to click on it right now, but that is an option available for you. And he just wanted to talk about some of the vocab that you would maybe come across if you were researching photography, or really things that we should be keeping in mind as we kind of set out as both poet and photographer for this project. So these are all skills that photographers have when they're composing a picture or set of pictures. All right, so when it comes to alignment, you want to follow the rule of thirds, or you kind of imagine a grid on your camera, and you want to have, what is it, 1/3? Yes, 1/3 of the space filled with your subject, and then the other 2/3 full of negative space. That's part of this focus as well at the very bottom. So we're not confused as to what our subject is. If there's too much happening in a photo, our eye doesn't know where to look. We get very confused as an audience, and the photo really has no purpose. Because if your audience can't appreciate your photo, then it kind of loses its value as a public work. All right, and there are some apps on, if you're shooting on a cell phone or something like that, that allow you to use a grid when you're taking that photo. If you don't want to wait until editing, if you want to try and think of those steps as you take the picture, which is a really strong move, you want to think of those rule of thirds, and you really want to try and capture those small kind of interesting details about your subject. All right, you don't want your photo to look like something that 20 other people are also going to take a picture of. When it comes to focus, You want to think, what is important to the audience? What kinds of things do you want to highlight or really sharpen in your work? Where do you want their eye to travel to? So in Ms. Decker's example, my focus is right in the middle of this photo because that's where this street is going. All of the lines are kind of pointing my eye there, and that's really drawing me in. There's a little bit of I don't want to say confusion because that sounds negative, but there's a little bit of kind of other interest with, there's this really interesting kind of branchy tree rising up out of the middle that's a little bit more in a sharp focus rather than all this stuff back here. The grass has been either sharpened intentionally or it's just kind of a sharp detail captured in the photo itself. But most of my attention is kind of drawn on this pathway. There's a sense of movement here in this picture. All right, perspective is talking all about the point of view. How can you shift that point of view? All right, so if you point your camera straight forward, then you're going to have a very you could have a flat perspective depending on if you're taking a picture of people or of landscape. This landscape looks like it's been shot from a pretty kind of straightforward position because that's how we get that kind of movement of lines down the center. You could also take a low shot, or you take your camera and you physically kneel down, or some photographers, like if you see wildlife photographers, they'll actually lay down on the ground with their camera in front of them to make their subject look a lot bigger. All right, if I'm trying to capture the height of an elephant, I could take a picture straight on, or I could take the perspective photo by laying down on the ground and taking it from its foot, turning my camera upward. That'll make that elephant look huge. If I want to make the elephant look smaller, which would be pretty hard to do, I'd want to take a picture from above. All right, so climbing a tree or hopping in a helicopter for this example. If I am shooting from above, everything that's being captured down below seems a lot smaller. All right, so just maybe shifting the angle of your camera or shifting your perspective can really change a photo. All right, it can make it unique to you. It can give it some extra life. The lines in Symmetry can really direct that focus. They kind of sum up this focus and alignment kind of thing. Some photos, like Ms. Decker's, have physical lines in them. Right? The lines of a street are very obvious. Maybe she would take another picture if she was trying to do this in a gallery of some power lines. I don't know, maybe. And she could play with how those power lines are cutting across the sky, or is she trying to shoot from a perspective where maybe the only thing we see, or she's going to lay down and look upward, and the only thing we see are those power lines. All right, where are the lines of your photo drawing our perspective? Now, that doesn't mean it has to be a physical line or an immovable line. A person can also form a line. I can stretch my arms out to the side and shift them into a diagonal, and that gives a new line for my audience to look at. Or I can reach a hand forward in an image, and that line from my shoulder going towards the camera lens forms a line for my audience to look at. If it's straight ahead and the camera straight ahead, that line will be very small because I'm shortening the space. But if I lower my hand a little bit so you see my palm all the way up to my shoulder, that forms a longer line because I'm giving more of my arm's presence towards the camera. All right, and the lines tend to be where the audience's eyes follow. All right, audiences can also respond to things like things being symmetrical in a photograph, or sometimes intentionally breaking up symmetry can also be a way to draw in your interest. I think one of the coolest things that photographers do is they play with the rules and they also break the rules. So if you've shot a couple of things using symmetry or trying to match things on either side of the photo, try breaking the symmetry for a shot or two and see how you like it. Lastly, as far as lighting goes, It's usually preferable to use as much natural light as possible. It helps add some life, it adds interest, it's more visually appealing in a photograph. Um, you can edit things like light work. You can edit to contrast, black and white, or like really deep in the shadows and really pop the highlights. Or sometimes there are some apps that let you kind of pick a color and then everything else you can kind of grayscale out, but that color remains. So if I'm trying to capture the life that I'm seeing around me, so it's springtime, grass is growing, flowers are starting to bud out, that kind of thing. Maybe I want to heighten the green, but then make everything else really gray is kind of an option that I have. You can also use things like reflections or shadows to help tell a story in a photo. Reflection images and shadow images tend to be really, really cool to look at. So if you can find them and use them, those can be pretty advantageous. Mr. Dickinson also put together this slide. He was going to fill it up full of editing apps for photography, but then he brought up in the Zoom that you guys probably know more about especially like cell phone editing tools than we do at this point. There are tons and tons and tons of free stuff. Please don't pay for anything. But there's tons of free stuff that you can use to create really awesome stuff, really awesome images. So just think of what tools are you using for editing? How are you utilizing things to create really unique perspectives? And then if you want to, how are you sharing your content? We want you to put your work on your Google Doc, which I'm just remembering, I'm pretty sure I forgot to go back and open that link for you. I will do that as soon as this part's done. But there are also lots of things like Instagram and whatever new stuff is out there past Instagram that is made specifically for sharing photo-based content. So what are you maybe choosing to share, or how are you composing a picture that would make sharing kind of valuable to you? How is an audience going to respond to that shared image? All right, before I forget, I want to go back to that graphic organizer. This should also be linked on everyone's Google Classroom at this point. But if you want to take this and open it up to plan your work, you can also turn it in on this. It's just a really quick condensed directions for this assignment. And then Ms. Decker's example, all in the row, the poem that she chose, the picture, and then her explanation for why she composed the picture the way she did. And then this section is for you guys. So this is where you would copy and paste your poem. Which poem from that 8 on that list are you focusing on? What image or images? You can put more than one picture in here if you want. Really capture your inspiration and then your explanation for that image or images. Okay, remember to email your teachers if you have any questions about your process or the steps that you're taking along the way. Maybe if you want to have some feedback given, don't be hesitant to reach out and ask some questions. And then we'll look forward to talking about this, doing a little bit of a recap before we add on to it on Wednesday. Remember, Wednesday Zoom is slightly different than normal. It's not at 11:30, it's at 11:15. It has been moved up by 15 minutes to accommodate a later meeting that day. Okay, so Wednesday Zoom, 11:15 a.m. I hope to see you there.